Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Alexander and today we've got a special guest, an author, Michael Le Flem. Hi Michael, how are you?
How are you? I'm good. How are you, Alexander?
Yes, great. I've read some parts of your book, The Visions of Atlantis, and it is actually really great, and I appreciate all your work. And in this conversation, we will actually, I think, dive deeper into the Atlantis and what is inside your book.
Sure. No,
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I'm excited to see as well, how much of our research overlaps. This is the first time we've met, and I'm curious to know. So, yeah.
Yes, so let me ask you, how do you, how actually you came up with the idea of Atlantis and how you started your research? What inspired you?
It's very strange. I had always been interested in history. I was a history professor for about 10, 11 years on and off in Chicago. And, I had studied modern history myself. But, one day, I think I was doing research on uh, remote viewing. I had been interested in that. And it led me to certain people who had, claimed to have seen these visions of this past time. And I started to think more about, you know, well, I had seen accounts, as a philosophy professor from Plato and things like this. And I didn't really pay much attention to it because, as I'm sure you're aware, Plato's accounts from Critias and Timaeus, they're not extraordinary. It's a civilization in the middle of the Atlantic with essentially Bronze Age, technology. And I was quite shocked by how many people were claiming, the case for high technology in this time period. And that question kind of perplexed me for a long time. How could Plato's account be, uh, how would I say, how could you bridge the two? Were the people that were talking about high technology, were they making it up, or was it a reflection of just their own 20th century visions, or was Plato talking about perhaps a final era of a previously advanced civilization himself? And so to get to that, I had to go into, the clairvoyant realm because there were very few, besides physical evidence, obviously the pyramids and things like this. But as you know, I'm sure, there are a few medieval accounts that suggest sound resonance technology as we would understand it were used and things like this. But there were no high technology texts that I could point to say, look, here's a tablet that says that they had the crystal technology in Atlantis and flying craft. And so it led me down this, first, I think it was the works of Edgar Cayce that I started to look into. And some of them are very detailed, but it still never gave a very clear picture of what real life would have been like. And so for me, as strange as it is, the key to it all in terms of the clairvoyant aspect of the book was A Dweller on Two Planets, which is a channeled book from 1881 by a 17-year-old kid who's living in a mining community near Mount Shasta in California. And, I had read that book a few times, and I think I had ended up reading it 6 to 7 times, actually, believe it or not. Maybe the only person on earth that has done that. But it was unbelievable, Alex, how detailed and internally coherent that book is. And when you compare it to things that Cayce said and other channelers said, it really brought to life these images. And in fact, it ended up answering the question I had, because in his version, he says he's channeling the life of a person who's apparently speaking through him in these automatic writing sessions. And the person tells him, look, I lived in 11,160 BC. Here's a very specific date. And he says, in the next 800 years after this, during the decline of the civilization, it basically regressed to a Bronze Age civilization with human sacrifice. People had forgotten how to use high technology, the crystal, and the leadership had basically removed themselves from physicality and become, in his word, like elemental forms of nature that could just basically affect things through astral projection without needing high technology, while the people essentially forgot how to, manufacture phones, because he describes cell phones in this. In fact, he describes holographic phones in this story. And they had forgotten basically all of the infrastructure of their civilization. And so by the time his account ends around 10,300 BC, closer to the time Plato would have been describing, it is a barbaric warrior like civilization that, would have been using spears and chariots and things like this. So I'm not saying that's absolute proof, but it definitely helped explain something that, I could never before that make sense of it, because I was very skeptical of the whole thing, just as, an investigator and a traditional historian. But I saw too much evidence that this was real, and too much remaining clues, which is the fourth chapter of the book, Fragments of Atlantis. Too many cultural clues that absolutely point to, however you want to describe it, a high ice age, globally connected, high technology civilization.
Yes, it is very, very interesting because I saw in your book that you really connect and quote many different authors from historians to actually ancient writers, and I think that it is that your perspective is a very good one, that you know you aren't accepting everything at a face value, that it is just true because some psychic said it, but you analyze it through the perspective of the official historical account. And I think that your book is really great in showing all of the details, both from the materialistic perspective and from this psychic perspective. I have a question. Have you ever experienced something psychic, or you just came to the conclusion after reading all of these accounts?
Um, it's weird. During the beginning, probably 8 years ago, when I first started to look into this material, there were a few times where I really can't explain. Like, I mean, I'm a good researcher, I guess. I've trained in that sense, but there were times where certain things connected in terms of a source or a realization of, wait a minute, this is that I honestly can't explain. And I don't know if you want to call that psychic or intuition or
Mm-hmm.
who knows, but there were certainly a couple things that I found in the book, um, that I couldn't believe nobody had found. And, I had really looked hard, like somebody must have come to this realization. And I don't think anybody has. We'll find out, I suppose, as more people read the book. But yeah, I think a lot of it was maybe, guided or influenced by something. I don't know, but it wasn't automatically written. I definitely sat there and spell checked and corrected, but certainly it it had times where I was just shocked, like sources would fall into place. Like I'm sure you found when you
Yes,
were
yes.
writing Deja Vu, where you're just like, where did that come from? you know?
Yes, I think that it is like a part of psychic experience. It may not be a clairvoyance or clairaudience, however, I think intuition also plays a large role in it. And I think that those intuitive insights actually show us that we are not just mere physical material bodies here, that maybe this version of taking information out of, let's say, Akashic records or out of these channelings may be actually true. What do you think about all of these channelings? Because you actually analyze Edgar Casey, this version of Dweller onto planets. What do you think? Are there any connections between them? There, of course, are. However, in your opinion, do it point that this information may be really valid? And as a historian, what do you think of this method of actually proving something from the past? Is it reliable?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was something that I focused on a lot because, you know, there were a lot of great books already on, you know, Edgar Casey's Atlantis, Edgar Casey's Egypt. There were, I don't think anybody has actually done a full review as I have of A Dollar on Two Planets. So that might be a new contribution. But I think the problem I had was uh, a lot of these books, you know, take, for example, excellent book, Edgar Casey's Atlantis. It presumes before you read page one that you believe in this and this is true. And that turns a lot of people off because they go, well, who is this guy? And, you know, I need to know more. So I really made it a point to show how did this person discover this ability? You know, he had suffered the loss of his voice and he couldn't speak for almost a year. And a hypnotist in 1901 actually came to the Hopkinsville Opera House where he was living in Kentucky. And somebody suggested, well, you should go get hypnotized. And during the hypnotic suggestion, he realized he could speak while he was under hypnosis. And after a few more sessions with another hypnotist, he actually cured himself. And the hypnotist said, you know, you probably have a strong psychic ability. And then he realized he could do that for other people remotely. And then over time, he started talking. I think the first time he mentioned Atlantis was in the 20s. So 20 years after he discovered this ability, he was giving a past life reading and he described the Atlantean experience, you know, and he didn't remember anything he said until he looked at the transcript. And so and he was studied by doctors from Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, the American Medical Association put him in jail because he was curing people and he didn't have a license. So, I mean, this is not a joke. And so I looked at, okay, what specific things did he say that I could maybe corroborate, you know, with archaeological, geological, or historical evidence to answer your question. And one of those was he was describing how around 10,500 BC, a group of people from Atlantis had traveled to the Giza Plateau to prepare for the coming catastrophe. And in this reading, he casually says, you know, at that time, the Nile River flowed into the Atlantic Ocean on the Congo end of the African continent. Now, he said that in 1932, something like that. Now, that's a strange statement because the Nile River does not flow into the Atlantic Ocean. Well, it turns out that in 1986, a radar from the space shuttle was able to penetrate 6 feet below the Sahara Desert, near the border of Nigeria, Cameroon, going into Congo. And indeed, they found a giant river that they claim in their own words was as big as the Amazon, and it probably originated where the current Nile River lies. Now, again, that's a data point that's significant. And other things, you know, he mentioned that the first, well, he talks about Lemuria as well. In fact, he even gives a date for the first incarnations, not as Homo sapiens, but as, thought forms or entities that would have been like spirits. And he gives a specific date. He puts that date at 10.5 million years ago. And he says in Lemuria, and he says that really the first Homo sapien, modern looking type people probably came around. And he's saying this, I think, in the 20s, before, this was common knowledge with DNA. We hadn't even discovered DNA. So he says that form began around 210,000 BC. Now, I found a study from Rice University that says we now think that, mitochondrial Eve, the woman that we all descend from, around 200,000 BC. So there's two, and as you go on and on, another one, he said he's talking to a guy, and he says, you had a past life during an episode of the first destruction of the continent of Atlantis, before it broke up into 5 islands, and then later it broke into 3, and one of those, Poseid, would have been what Plato was describing. But originally, he says it was a large continent that spanned from the Gulf of Mexico all the way across to Spain. And so he says, you were there during the first breakup of the continent of Atlantis. And the guy said, well, what happened? Was it natural? He said, no. He said, at that time, there were giant animals roaming the earth, which is true. There was the megafauna. And he says, you were part of a group that an international great congress that met using flying machines. They met somewhere, probably in Egypt, and they decided on how to deal with these megafauna. And he says it was decided to use a crystal and essentially some sort of directed energy weapon, laser. He says the death ray because he's writing in 1932 and he doesn't have the words to use, And so he says, you used basically an energy weapon. You beamed it at the stratosphere. It bounced off and it entered all the volcanic flows around where these giant animals were gathering. And something went terribly wrong, and you fractured the crust of the earth, and you precipitated a magnetic pole shift that had already been in process. And it turns out that it destroyed the megafauna and changed the climate. And the guy says, what date was that? And he says 50,722 BC. Now, I cite an article from a peer-reviewed archaeology journal where they say, or a biology journal, I believe, and they say around 50,000 BC, there was a major megafaunal extinction. And we have no idea why, but we attribute it to human hunting, or we don't know. Well, they're correct, but I don't think it was hunting. I think perhaps Casey was right. And so, you find more and more and more of these things, and you think, okay, that's probably a very reliable source, and I put like a value arrange, I will arrange kind of like credibility to him at that level. And then I go to Frederick Oliver, who never gave psychic readings for anybody. He only wrote this one book. He was 17 years old. It was never published in his lifetime. So the motive to be sensational doesn't make any sense. And what he says in it in 1881, before Edgar Casey, is almost identical to the world Casey describes. Now, you could say, well, Casey just read that book and copied it, but then Casey says things that Oliver never said, and vice versa, but the themes are essentially the same. They're both talking about a civilization that ended around 10,000 plus or minus 500 year BC. Plato himself is talking about a civilization that ended around 9,600 plus or minus 200 BC. And we know that that's when the Younger Dryas period ended, and probably a catastrophe befell the earth. So it's like, how did Plato, through Solon, through the temple priests at Sais, how did they guess that date if it's all made up. It doesn't make sense. It actually makes much more sense if you're being honest that this really did happen. And like you said in your book, it's deja vu. You know, we are just coming back to a basic level of technology that we had surpassed by probably orders of magnitude tens of thousands of years ago. And that's you know, I think a lot of people, they get scared with that. I think the main opposition is like it's arrogance, and it's also fear, because you think, well, if we had technology that basically was at the level of Star Wars and things that we fictionalized, you mean to tell me we either had a comet, or we destroyed ourselves, or something else happened, and that could happen again? And I think that's probably what keeps most people from believing it, because Western philosophy pretends that, well, if we have rockets and iPhones and the internet, nothing bad could happen. That only happened to primitive people. When in fact, you know, we have nuclear weapons, we have directed energy weapon, we have HARP, we have all sorts of things that we could use to destroy the Earth, not to mention extraterrestrial comets and things like this that we cannot control. So I think, you know, the main opposition is not like the evidence, because the evidence is there, as you know. The evidence is very abundant. It's psychological. And so I think that was like, especially when I would tell the story to my friends or people that I was, you know, sharing my ideas with, it was, you could see their fear of like, there's no way that could happen. You mean that actually happened? Yes, probably. And it could happen again. In fact, it's probably going to happen again at some point. I don't think that's a question. So, you know, if you want to live like in fear and ignorance, that's your choice. Or if you want to be an adult, maybe you could take these lessons and learn from it, you know, and then think about, well, if history is cyclical and we always get destroyed by ourselves or natural disaster, perhaps we should focus on fixing that instead of all these other silly things that we seem to be preoccupied with. You know what I mean?
Yes, and I think that it was one of the greatest things in your book that you've just said, that, you know, you aren't just proving Edgar Casey or other psychics, and you aren't either just proving the mainstream academic version, but you actually combine them both together and see if those psychic readings and other psychic information can be validated by some other information from, as you mentioned, scientific journals or the true history, true historical records. And I think that it was one of the best things in your books, because as I was writing in my book, I've actually excluded most of the information about, you know, psychic things, because
Sure.
because, you know, in my life I came across actually two kinds of people. Either they are proving the psychic right, or they are disproving psychic. But I think that you in your book aren't doing,
Right.
you aren't either proving or disproving them. You just show the clear picture, you show where they can be validated or where they cannot, and you just came to a conclusion after this analysis. And I think that this is one of the greatest things I've came across your book. And it's very interesting because
Thank you.
I've read plenty of books about Atlantis, you may also, and it is interesting
Sure.
to see different perspectives, that people may think that, oh, another book about Atlantis. However, it is, any book is different, and every book has something to it, something
Sure.
original, and something that may actually also be based on the same evidence or similar evidence. However, it points further and further connects the dots. And it's very
That's right.
interesting because, as you mentioned, this fear and this opposition actually for anything like that, any advanced civilizations and other stuff in the past. So I've came across many of the criticism of my work and others, and what was the main criticism? It was like, it was so long ago, but where are the evidence? There are some evidence,
Oh
however,
God.
actually it isn't,
Sure.
it doesn't take that long for other evidence, like you've mentioned, the technology to disappear, because I was
Right.
mentioning it in my
Right.
book that, any plastics, any metals, etc., actually corrode
Of
and
course.
decay very, very fast. So I think that the mainstream
Of course.
should take more approach like you in just saying what can be a fact and what is connected, and not the approach that they are now taking, that that they are just refuting all of this because it cannot be
Right.
proven, because it is psychic. And actually they are, in my opinion, arrogant and ignorant of these sources, which are, as you've mentioned in your book, very, very valuable. So
Well, that's that's a that's a great point, and I have two things to say about that. One is, they're approaching this the only way that their limited thinking is capable, which is the way the entire historical profession is trains you, which is if you don't have, you know, tablets or pottery shards or a book or this, it never existed. But if you take this at face value, and let's just use a conservative date, let's not even go back to 100,000 BC, which is an extraordinarily difficult time period to say anything about. Let's just go back to 10,500 BC, when I believe the pyramids were started. When Edgar Cayce, by the way, that's another one. Edgar Cayce said in a reading, he was asked specifically, when did the Great Pyramid of Giza begin in terms of construction? Without hesitation, he said, and he said this in the 30s, which is very important to keep in mind. In 1932, again, he gave a lot of these readings then in that year. He said 10,490 BC. They said, when did it end? He said 10,390 BC. Now, that's an extraordinarily strange date if you consider that when Robert Bauval discovered that the pyramids are aligned to the constellation of Orion, as Orion would have appeared around 10,400 BC. I mean, how did he know that? How did Edgar Cayce come up with that date unless he's telling the truth? And to answer your second question, or statement, let's say that's true. Well, Edgar Cayce's son said this famously, and I quote it in the book. He says, look, if something happened like what happened back then, right now, and he was writing in the 60s, he said, let's fast forward to the year 14,000 AD. And he says, somebody comes and drills a 2-inch hole in the bottom of the ocean. Are they going to find a city? Are they going to find New York? As you mentioned, are they going to find a car, an iPhone? No, they're not going to find anything. And he says, and people will probably, and I'm paraphrasing, and people will probably say something like, oh, you believe in that legend of America? Because, I mean, it doesn't even take 14,000 years, or 12,000 years rather, as you mentioned, for stainless steel, titanium, metal, glass, everything but megalithic structures, which we don't build anymore, to withstand, the winds and sands and waters of time. So if anything were to be left, I mean, truly, like, what would be left of our civilization? Absolutely nothing. And as I mentioned in the book, because he was writing in the 60s, before everything was stored in the internet, in the cloud and servers, can you imagine, if our current civilization right now ended and there were no more servers and there were no more programming languages? And I mean, how would you even decode what we had? We don't even store things in libraries anymore. So if a civilization like Atlantis had, vast archives, and of course, people have mentioned the Hall of Records and things like this, and that they had put some information encoded in crystals or etc., physical objects in, various places around the earth. But I mean, even that couldn't be comprehensive, in terms of, even if we were to find this Hall of Records, like what would we really get out of that beyond what we project on it, unless there's something there that's, extraordinary that they foresaw being needed. So again, it's like, well, what would you find? Well, you'd find the pyramids of Giza, for example. I love it when people say, well, where's the evidence? Well, right there. There's one. I don't know, Gobekli Tepe. There's two. And you keep going, and then you realize, well, what else would be left? I don't know, cultural, linguistic lineages that make no sense. Oral traditions that are timeless, that all essentially point from various cultures to the same event. And what else? I guess you'd have to go by, fragmentary sources, as I mentioned in the first chapter, citing some of the people that pre-Platonic sources, very few and very little said about it. But it's not just Plato, anytime somebody says, oh, it's just Plato, and he uses this as a literary device, it's like, that's not true. And you could see that that's not true, because there was a ceremony 200 years before Plato that celebrated the war of the Athenians against the Atlantides, So if anything, Plato based his dialogues off a real ceremony, So I mean, that alone, that's not like a spurious source. That's a real ceremony. And, if you look at Indian sources where they're talking about similar things, they might use a different name. They might call it Atalia, the White Island, things like this. But they put it at the location, essentially where Plato put it. So it's like, okay, the Indians are talking about a 10-year war with the island of Atalia near the Canary Islands. Plato's talking about Atlantis. I mean, these are not coincidental things to me, And so I think it's just really unfortunate that we've had to convince, people of something that should be taught from an early age, because could you imagine, Alex, learning about the history of the 20th century and you don't study World War I or World War II? You just start last year. And that's a bad example, because that's only 100 years of history we're skipping. We're skipping, if this is true, 250,000 years. And I'm not saying we can conclusively say this happened or that happened, but as you get closer to the end of it, where most of these channeled readings seem to take place, it's quite interesting and quite compelling, because you see basically our society right now just more advanced, with the same drama, the same factions. You have in many channel readings a transhumanist branch of people that go off one way and try to enslave humanity through crystal implants, and deploy a technology that fractures the Earth's crust through a resonant waveform that goes crazy, in Barbara Hand Cloud's version. In Casey's, it's a crystal technology that's abused, that is responsible many times over tens of thousands of different years of iterations of this technology, that continues to come back and blow up the Earth or blow up the landmass. And so it's not just like a fairy tale, it's a very, very important, to me, lesson of like what happens when you reach the power where you have the technology to destroy life on Earth, which to some degree we do today, although I would never equate nuclear weapons with the powers of these things they had, which were in various versions going into the Earth's core. I hope we don't have anything that can do that, but it's a warning of like, well, what if we ever had the Tuoi crystal, or what if we ever had these other technologies that could end life on Earth, would we behave the same way? And I don't know. Looking around the Earth now, I might have to say yes. We really haven't learned the lesson. Because we don't think this is a true story. So we think this is the first time we've ever been faced with weapons of mass destruction, which I don't believe we have. And I think that's very clear from the channelings and the evidence that I've seen.
Yes, I totally agree actually with all your points, all you've just said. And it is very interesting because we say about this lesson that we haven't learned anything. And I think that all of that is connected to the cyclicality of time, to many different actually traditions of cyclical time all around the world, and that it is also connected a little bit, as we see these previous lifetimes, with reincarnation and why are we here, because maybe some of the people haven't learned the lessons and had to
Right.
reincarnate again. And in my book I
Right.
provide an example from David Wilcock of really
Ah,
repeated history in another zodiacal epoch, exactly 2160 years. And it's actually
wow.
a very similar scenario that happened again, and even with, in my opinion, the same people, because even their facial expressions are almost the same. And I think that it is really connected with those lessons, with those lessons and with those metaphysical things. And I've actually recently read a great book about yugas, these Hindu cycles of time.
Ah, yes.
And actually, you've mentioned that I think this peak was 11,500 BC. Am I right? Of this
Yeah,
peak of
around there.
around there. And I found these three Yuktasvars actually division of the yugas, which also say that the peak of the Satya Yuga, the golden era in Hindu thought, was also about 11,500 years BC, and then
Wow.
it was actually
Wow.
like the Atlantis. It was in the descending period. So it might
Wow.
point to the true events, and that it was all about these cycles of time, these cycles of dharma, of karma, and that it may be all connected, and that this Plato's Atlantis and this Atlantis story may be really true.
Oh, that's interesting. That's fascinating. I was not aware that the what did you call it, the Satya?
Yugas, and this was Satya Yuga, the golden era.
Uh-huh. Wow. It makes sense. That makes
Yes.
perfect sense because in the world of Frederick Oliver, he even describes, he's channeling the past life of a person who lives on Poseid, which again is very interesting because he calls the island Poseid and he refers to the culture as Atlantis, much the way you would call, the British Empire, and then you have England. And it's interesting that he says Poseid, and Casey as well. They call it Poseid. They don't say on the island of Atlantis. And it's interesting because in Plato's account, in the direct center of the circular city is the Temple of Poseidon. Now, Edgar Casey says there were two other islands around there at the time of the final destruction, the island of Og and the island of Arion. And I know that I remember Michael Tsarian has mentioned that, Ireland linguistically is a derivative of Arion. And he, has I guess an argument of the Irish origins of civilization and things like this. And in a weird way, in other channelings, more recent one, it was the people from Arion who had become the technocrats and were vying for control of the island of Poseid. And they didn't really mention too much about the island of Og. But it's interesting because Plato himself says it was an island that ruled over all the other islands in that archipelago. And again, people just, they don't read the primary source. They forget that he says it was a military empire that had dominion as far as Egypt, all through the Mediterranean. And, if you look, for example, at different things in the Mediterranean along the coast, I mean, it actually makes sense. And, going back to the Nile River emptying into the Atlantic, uh, I put something together that I'm curious to know what you think as an expert on this. The eye of the Sahara that everybody always has been pointing, and I think very correctly they make the connection. And I have a great picture in the book of an artistic rendering of the eye of the Sahara compared to, or I'm sorry, of Plato's Atlantis by a Spanish illustrator who let me reuse her image, and the eye of the Sahara, and it's identical. In fact, it's impossible to deny that that is the same exact city that Plato described dimensionally. It's identical, even with the inlet and the exact level of concentric rings. And it makes sense because in Plato's Atlantis, North Africa was a colony of that. Even though the Eye of the Sahara is in Mauritania, Edgar Cayce said, you can find evidence of this civilization in parts of Morocco. And I'm not sure at the time what the border of Morocco and Mauritania was, but I mean, that's the next bordering country. And he was giving this reading in the 30s, so maybe he was just, estimating. But it's not that far away from Morocco. And if you think about it, I'm not saying that's literally where Atlantis was, or Poseid even. It's possible, but that would have been, even according to mainstream science, a fertile, filled with rivers and lakes region 12,000 years ago. So where the Eye of the Sahara is now could have been filled with water. And it could have been either the actual city Plato was describing. I'm fine with that. Although I'm not sure, because it's not in an island landmass. I still think the Azores are where Plato was mentioning. But it could have been a reproduction. It could have been a sister city. I mean, certainly it's not just, even NASA says officially, and I dug very deep in their records, we have no explanation for the high degree of circularity, because it's not a natural formation. They cannot explain it. There's no, geolites inside of it to say it's volcanic. It's not. It wasn't a meteor strike. Obviously it's, something else. And so if that was a, verdant green lake and river region, and then Nile flowed through it, somebody probably built a version of it, the capital city of Atlantis, in that location. And again, there's evidence. Like when people say there's not, it's like, what is this? How do you explain this? What is this? And so you know what it is? I think, Alex, it's just people don't pay attention to details. And that's what chapter 3 is about, which is basically engaging with some of the, quote unquote debunking community in the mainstream media, in the blogosphere, in the Amazon sphere, whose arguments are, some of them are good. I mean, it's good to have debunkers, because a lot of them, for example, with mistranslations of a lot of Sanskrit texts that have been forged, like I personally believe Vimanas existed, but I don't base that on a lot of texts that were absolute forgeries. And I know David Hatcher Childress has been accused of that, not forging, but using texts that themselves were not original Sanskrit texts. And so you have to be careful. So I appreciate that. But it becomes like an ideology with them, because they will not accept any evidence. They have decided this is fake. And so it doesn't matter if me and Alex, show them a Atlantean, flying craft that we dig out of the dirt in Giza. It doesn't matter. They are emotionally, psychologically incapable of admitting this is even possible. So I don't even pay them any attention. I just show how, you know, most of them, the grand majority of these people, Michael Shermer, people that write for Slate, things like this, they have not even read the material.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And I think that we shouldn't be opinionated. And as you mentioned, they have got ideology. They say that they are skeptics to show that the science is objective, and actually they are disproving it, showing the scientific ideology, especially in the history, because in many other branches of sciences, like natural sciences of physics, it is a little bit different to disprove something that is truly false. However, in this
Right.
case, history with our knowledge, history isn't either white or black. We've got plenty of mysteries that you and I are discovering and are
Mm.
investigating, and we shouldn't be ignoring something because we've got some worldview about how our history really unfolded. Going back to the Eye of the Sahara, it is very interesting. I found out that, for instance, in Herodotus' histories, there is a mention
Mm.
that people below the Gibraltar, so Morocco, etc., were called the Atlantis. So
That's
there's a
right.
similarity here. I don't know if you've mentioned it in your book, and
I do.
I must have omitted or I haven't read it yet,
No,
and
it's fine.
it is very interesting. This Eye of Saqqara, I think that it may be one of these, like you've mentioned, these sisters cities. Like the colonies, like Egypt was a colony, because as you
Right.
mentioned, it was in Plato's account, it was beyond the pillars of Hercules. However, looking back at the very, very remote epoch, in which, the Sahara was a fertile desert, maybe from the geological perspective, it was also like surrounded by waters. So maybe,
Very
Eye of
possible.
the Sahara is like a little below Pillars of Hercules, but it
Exactly.
doesn't disprove that it isn't beyond them. So it may be the
Exactly.
Atlantis, but was it the main city or was it one of the cities? As you mentioned, it was most probably a few inlets, not one great continent. And it's very interesting because you also mention many different stories of Atlantis, many different sources. And recently, I have gathered some information about the true Egyptian Atlantis. I don't know if you've heard
Really.
in the Edfu texts. These texts are
Mm.
not fully translated. Some of them are translated because these texts go for thousands of pages right now. But
Mhm.
about, let's say, a quarter of that was translated, of course, by Egyptologists, not by some
Sure.
frauds. And
Sure.
according to Edfu texts, really the true gods, the first gods of Egypt, came from the island. And this island was called like Island of Flame or of Fire, I don't remember well. But the
Sure.
same story was found in the Mexico because this pre-Mexican, let's say, state from which the Quetzalcoatl and other gods came was
Sure.
also the island of flame or fire. It was very
That's
similar,
right.
and there are also many other connections. I found linguistic connections, like between many languages. It is interesting because, like older investigators, older explorers, like for instance Augustus Le Plongeon, who of course
Yes,
made some mistakes. However, we shouldn't,
he did.
because he made some mistakes, we shouldn't dismiss
Sure.
him.
Who
Uh,
doesn't make mistakes?
Yes,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly. Exactly. So he found many similarities between Mayan and Egyptian script. And also
Mm.
recently I found correlations and similarities between the let's say Pumapunku Tiwanaku language, if it exists, like
Sure.
from this region, and
Hmm.
with the ancient Sanskrit. So we've got many of correlation between these names. And what I remember from your book is that in many channelings, some of the names of the places were very similar, for instance, to the language of the Aztecs, etc. There were some
Oh,
of the
yes.
names, and it is very interesting because it was a time when this knowledge wasn't like general knowledge. Not many people knew about it, and it's interesting that we can find it in these channelings.
It's very interesting. And, I did something, as you mentioned, a lot of people, Le Plongeon, Ignatius Donnelly, Gian Rinaldo Carli in the 1800s, all of them noted this correlation between, Nahuatl language in Mexico, the Basque language, things like this that make no sense in a pre-Columbian context, absolutely make no sense. But I touched on that, but I really wanted to go even further to show, like, for example, in a lot of these past life readings, Edgar Cayce gives the person their past life name. So if you were getting a reading, it's not just like Alexander, you lived in Atlantis. It's like your name was Oxtel or Mixoteca or Onxor. And I have a whole list. And what I did was I took a sampling of, I think, 15 names that Edgar Cayce gave, male and female, for just different characters, going alphabetically to get a good spread. Then I compared those to modern Basque names. Then I compared those to modern, or, the Nahuatl language is only spoken by a few people now, but Nahuatl names, they're all the same. So, I mean, Edgar Cayce, by his son's admission, only read the newspaper and the Bible. He was not a Basque philologist. So if he was guessing, that's an extraordinary guess. Another thing he said was, before the destruction of the island, they went to the Yucatan, Giza, and the Pyrenees Mountains. Well, Yucatan, Nahuatl language. Pyrenees, that's where the Basque language originates. Egypt, there you go. So again, it's like, this is impossible to explain unless he actually was telling a version of the truth. And, by his own admission, he said, look, I'm pulling from the light records, the Akashic records. I'm pulling from something that doesn't exist the same way, physical records exist. So it depends, he said, like a record, you could have the same record, and depending on the fidelity of the record player, you're going to get a better sound. And he said, like, I'm a master of this, but I have to be within a certain group context. I have to be in a trance. If people are in the room that have bad energy, it's not going to work for me. And it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be something close, but I think it's pretty damn close if you look at it. And, that shocked me, was the past life names are internally coherent. And in fact, they actually sound like Nahuatl or Basque names today. And that's bizarre. And even in Frederick Oliver's book, Frederick Oliver was a 17-year-old kid in Eureka, California. Where the hell did he get a Basque dictionary to make this up if this is the case? And how would he know that? And his names as well sound like Nahuatl or Basque names for his characters in A Dweller in Two Planets. So again, it's too many things were coinciding for me to ignore the psychic sources, because actually, when I started writing this book, I think I had maybe a couple Cayce quotes. I didn't even use Frederick Oliver, and I definitely didn't use any of the modern channelers. I was doing kind of what you did, which is just, looking at standard evidence in a new way. But I realized that I wanted to really show people the power of a handful of very, very well done.
Okay, welcome back. Unfortunately, something crashed. However, we will continue our journey through Atlantis and lost civilizations in another time. Don't forget to check out links for Michael's book, Visions of Atlantis, and other links in the descriptions. So, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. It was really great, very valuable, all of the information and all of the connections. And that's why we'll continue the conversation in the future. Therefore, thanks for watching and have a nice day.
Okay. Thank you, Alexander. I'll talk to you soon.